Welcome everyone. Hope that you can hear me okay. Um, if you can't, please put something in the chat so that I can address that. But thank you all for joining us for our first virtual learning circle with the Purdue Black Cultural Center, Equity in the Arts, or the lack thereof, featuring Dr. Kelli Morgan. A little bit of housekeeping. We're gonna begin at 12:05 right now. We were waiting to allow some guests time to log in. If you have questions as she is delivering her presentation, please feel free to put that into the chat, and I will facilitate that Q&A at the end of Dr. Morgan's presentation. That's going to last for about 10 to 15 minutes. I'm sure it's going to be juicy. I'm so looking forward to Dr. Kelli Morgan's presentation today. She's got a lot of wisdom to share. There's also going to be a link to a survey shared at the end of the session. Please take a moment to leave your comments in that so that we can continue to create good programming that best suits your needs. So, Dr. Kelli Morgan is originally from Detroit, Michigan. She's a curator, an author, an educator, and a social justice activist. She earned her doctorate in Afro-American Studies and a graduate certificate in public history and museum studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, or UMass. Specializing in critical race curatorial analyses, her interdisciplinary research focuses on Black women's visual narratives. Most recently, her work has demonstrated how traditional arts history and museum practice uphold white supremacy and maintain white cultural hegemony. She's held curatorial positions at Birmingham Museum of Art, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields, where she recontextualized American collections to illuminate systemic racism and structural inequities to encourage responsible approaches to museum diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, or DEI. Currently, Dr. Morgan is an independent curator and art consultant. Thank you, Dr. Morgan, for being with us today.
Thanks, Anicia, for having me. Thank you, everybody, for logging in and giving me an hour of your day. So many of you know me personally, and for those of you who don't, also welcome. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. A lot of you have heard me say a lot of the stuff that I'm going to say today. You've heard me say it before. But maybe not so much, in this context, right? There's a lot of conversation, happening in the museum world and the art world right now around equity. And I like to say, or the lack of equity, because museums really, particularly large traditional institutions, right? It's like they were not designed to be equitable. And as many of you, who are here today know, I just recently resigned my position at one such institution, the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields, particularly, specifically for that reason, right? And it was a very public resignation, which was also deliberate, on my part, because I really wanted people to see what it looks like, right, when an institution claims to be or wants to be, right, dedicated to inclusivity, dedicated to equity, but isn't really ready to do that, right? Doesn't have the structures, isn't ready to really look at itself, deeply, to really create, though, a genuine culture around those things. And part of my impetus, in doing that was to also, illuminate there's a very real chasm that exists, particularly with large, cultural institutions or large museums, the traditional institutions, where, it is this idea, that we as an institution are committed to diversity, or we're committed to inclusion because we show Black artists in the gallery, right? Or we show artists of color, in the gallery, or we acquire, right, works by artists of color, where there is no realistic or sufficient acknowledgement, let alone, sort of sufficient addressing of the very toxic and traumatic and oppressive, things that are happening to people of color in the building, right? And so it was really important for me one, as a curator, two, as a person, and three, as an activist, right? To kind of lay that out, right? So that the public can then see, the workings of this, and how it affects, right, Black museum professionals. And so, it sort of unfolded, in the way that it did. So for me, as a curator, let me actually go to the next slide. Oops. Yep. Okay, so first and foremost, and like those who follow me on social media, I know you've seen this before. I had to shout out my colleague Allison Bowers, who made these for me. I was so excited when she did these for me. But if we're going to talk about equity, the first thing that we really need to acknowledge is why the inequity exists. And I think as much conversations is happening, right? That is the issue that kind of boils my blood, right? That just gets under my skin, because it's like, 4% or whatever, the statistic is now, 12%, of museum professionals, are Black, or 90%, of museum collections are all white, white men. There are reasons for that, so we can start there. Okay, that's fine. You can acknowledge that, but like there is something that literally undergirds that, right? That's a foundation for that. And that is the fact that museums themselves, right? If you go all the way back to the French Revolution, in the establishment, right, of the public museum, in just the French context, the British context is something else. But the museum itself, right, was established as a space to really codify, white identity, particularly white male identity, right? But through using very staunch systems of classism, I would say scientific racism, and sexism. So if that is the foundation of the institutional model, right, itself, like collecting Black artists, and now, collecting Black museum professionals, are not really going to change that, right? You really have to change the structure in and of itself. So coming into this work, right, where I wanted to do that, for me, it wasn't only about, right, bringing in works of artists of color, celebrating artists of color, cultivating, right, collectors of color, cultivating communities of color. It was also about changing the structure, right, for me. And so I started to approach this work in this way, after my time at the Birmingham Museum of Art. I say all the time, I got my curatorial chops at the Birmingham Museum of Art. And this is the question that, really grounded, my approach. It was like, how can curators activate permanent collections? And I would also say the museum space, museum galleries, right, through methodologies that directly address the realities and the truth of systemic racism. How is the institution itself a representation, right, of such systems? And being recruited to do this work at Newfields was like so serendipitous. Particularly when you talk about space, because upon, moving to Indianapolis, one of the first things I noticed, in my, just kind of driving around the city, is that Newfields exists, on the red line, 38th Street. If you're from Indy or you're from Indiana, you know Indianapolis, 38th Street is like the very hard red line in the city, right? So it divides north from south, which also breaks down along class lines between the have and the have-nots, and it breaks down on racial lines between white and Black, right? So majority of the communities south of 38th are Black communities. The majority of the communities north of 38th are very affluent, and I mean ridiculously affluent, white communities, that are affluent particularly or specifically, right, because of the resources that are siphoned out, of the Black communities south of 38. So here's a view. It's not the greatest picture, but it's like, here's a view of what one sees, when you get to that corner where 38th Street meets the sort of north-south demarcation, where south of 38th, the street is Martin Luther King, Boulevard. North of 38th, it turns into Michigan Road, right? So in that regard, Newfields and the cemetery sort of function as like this gate, right? So it's this geographical marker of that I like to describe as like the don't pass go, don't collect $200. You're realizing that you are making some kind of crossover to something else, right? From some place into a new place, just due to the fact that the street name changes, right? Now, this isn't unique to Indianapolis, right? There are this is very unique to redlining. So this happens, in cities across the country, but specific to the institution, particularly now that it's taken up this inclusivity as a core value, it's like you have to really deal with the fact that you're a geographical representation, or you're a physical representation of geographical racism at your gate. How about starting there? When you want to talk about being inclusive, right? So you literally are sitting, on the old Lilly estate. You know what I'm saying? Like, how many people in that history, like how many people were forced out of that space, right? As Lilly expanded the ownership of that land. And even actually the people who owned that land before, right? The Lilly family. But just digging up, right? And kind of excavating, I should say, the roots of inequity in a space in and of itself, right? So that was something, that I actually stated, when I initially got, or assumed the position, came into the position. That didn't necessarily get a whole lot of traction, right? But when you are doing equity work, or you're doing, critical race curatorial analysis or anti-racism, social justice work, for me at least, it's like I do it in steps, right? You have to, which is what I kind of call, and I think other DEI, workers, would call taking an institution's temperature, right? So you have to see how open, right, an institution is. First of all, how committed are they really, to inclusivity and equity, and how open are they to doing the work? So saying that, right, in public lectures, one of my first public lectures I gave, I kind of delineated out the whole geographical racism narrative that I, just, stated, to you guys, and, in this forum, right? And like I said, it didn't really gain much traction. So the second thing I did is I had because I was like, okay, that didn't really go over, right? Or didn't land, with administration. Landed with people in the community, right? But didn't necessarily land with administration. So I said, okay, I'll try something else. And I had this big Barclay Hendricks painting that a lender in Philly, was willing to loan. And so I said, okay, so now I'm going to put a big Black man, in a very prominent space, next to one of the most prominent and important works by one of the most, I think, important white female artists, Georgia O'Keeffe, and the Jemison Wade painting, right? So hung this pen, I was like, okay, I'll see how this goes, right? And now granted, I will also say, this is kind of what my grandmother would call like not letting your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so behind the scenes, just for me personally, and maybe some people that I talk to, on a more, kind of close-knit level, like knew, kind of what my subversive intention, was in a lot of the things that I did starting out. But again, it's like testing, right? So it's like I installed the painting. The painting was a hit, right? So it was just like, okay, so there is a want, right? There is a desire. So I was like, okay, if this can go well, I can move into some of the other, right, more respected, right, specialized, quote unquote, sacred spaces in the institution and break some things up there and see how that goes over. And so that is why you see this image that's on the screen right now. So the Rotunda Gallery, in the American Suite, very much so a specialized space, also kind of branded, right, as a sacred space. So yoga happens in this space. People come in, have meditative moments. It's a very, kind of ethereal, spiritual space as well. But it was also a very Indiana specific space, and it was a very white space, right? So upon starting the position, it's like this kind of crown jewel, of the American galleries, particularly because of the Tiffany window. And that was, how it was introduced to me and explained to me. And for myself, coming into the space, it was very oppressive, right? Because it was so stark and it was so white. And as much as it is an Indiana specific space, which I actually think is pretty cool, but there were other Indiana specific stories that could be present in this gallery that were absolutely not, right? So so as much as we're talking about Indiana history and we're representing Indiana artists, there's no mention, right? There's nothing that talks about Indiana Avenue. There's nothing that talks about, Native and Indigenous histories, right? And cultural histories in Indiana. And so I thought that was very fascinating. So in my mind, asking myself if I had one of my classes from Philly, right? Or one of my classes from Detroit visit this space, because I wasn't teaching, in India at this time. It was like, how would my Muslim students feel coming into this space, right? How would my Black and, Latinx students, feel coming into this space? Would I even feel comfortable bringing them into this space? Not really, right? And then because of the gender dynamics, right, that were on display in the space, it was like, how would my queer students, even feel? Because this is a space that really codifies in a way, white femininity. And, going back to the Indiana, aspects of it, this painting here, right, on the left, is a piece by Theodore Grohl, painted, it's a scene of downtown Indiana, painted in like the late 1890s, right? I'll get to the Indiana connections to the Tiffany window in a minute. But this was between the point when it was commissioned and actually installed in First Presbyterian Church. It was like 1901 to 1905. This is a painting of a white female sitter by Indiana artist Ruth Pratt Bobs that was done in, I think, 1907. And there were two other works, that were installed in the rotunda. Also this around the same time. So it was like the dates, across each piece were the Gilded Age, so like I said, again, 1890s, to, turn of the century, basically. And so that was an interesting thread for me, because I was like, what do we know about the Gilded Age, right? This moment of like, this boom of Northern industrialization, is kind of the birth of urban realism, in American art, but there was something very specific happening in the South that was fueling all of that Northern activity, and that certain something was the establishment of Jim Crow segregation, right? So it's like, put a pin in that, right? So thinking about, how my students would feel, thinking about that connection, in regards to the date, and like moving forward from there. This is just another view, of yoga in the galleries. And so the yoga was important to me because, in regards to my relationship and my, I would say how crucial Christina Sharp's work, is to my curatorial philosophy and my work. And it reminded me of this particular passage. And, I won't read it to you. I know you guys can read it on your own. But it was like, okay, here's very much so like a representation of how the institution is creating a particular pedagogy. Like using this space to create a pedagogy around Indiana, or specifically Indianapolis, right, to create a particular pedagogy around meditation and spirituality, right, and relaxation, and, you know, these kind of like transcendent experiences. So like instructing people, right, to have a very particular experience in the gallery, which there's nothing wrong with that, right? But what does that leave out? You know, and that is the very, I think, you know, really important thing about critical race theory, right? It teaches you how to see the absences. It teaches you how to see what's not there, you know? And so I was like, that's going to be my next step, you know, is flushing out, you know, and really sort of forcing visitors to deal with what's not there. And so I started with the two pieces that actually anchored the gallery, which is the window, the Tiffany window, and the Paxton. And the Tiffany window is actually called Angel of Resurrection. Again, design 1903, 1904. And it was commissioned by Mrs. Benjamin Harrison, right? The wife of our 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison, was also, you know, son of Indiana. And they were members of First Presbyterian Church. Benjamin Harrison was very active in the church. So she commissioned it upon his death in 1901. It was installed in the church in 1905. And it is a beautiful window, right? Like there's no denying, you know, its aesthetic, you know, value. And you can definitely, again, you know, kind of have that, you know, transcendent kind of experience with it. But what I found, you know, super interesting about it is how Michael is dressed. And it's Archangel Michael, you know, sort of calling the dead, you know, to rising the dead, like, you know, from sleeping for the second coming of Christ. And he has, if you look really closely, he has like the chainmail suit on, right, of a crusading knight. So again, going back to this timeline of Gilded Age works, you know, from the 1880s to turn of the century. There's a very particular American romanticism regarding crusading knights that had a whole lot to do, you know, with what white men were doing specifically to reestablish Jim Crow segregation in the South, right? So again, this is Klan history, right? And not just the Klan, because you have to understand that, you know, mob violence in the South, you know, these were upstanding, affluent white folks. These were judges. These were police officers, right? Deputies, sheriffs, you know, many, you know, business owners, this kind of thing. It wasn't just like, you know, you're kind of fumbling, bumbling, poor whites, even though, you know, they participated as well. You know, so then I was like, well, that's fascinating, you know, that you have this kind of knight mythology here, that in reading the art history is linked back to Benjamin Harrison's service in the Union Army. So then, which again, right, opens this up to even, makes this even more intriguing, because he was you know, he did serve in the Union Army, but at the time, you know, he really wasn't like an anti-slavery activist, right, or anti-slavery advocate. You know, once he came back to Indiana, you know, he did help, you know, certain families relocate, you know, to Indiana, Black families, you know, relocate and get settled in Indiana. You know, he was very much so about, you know, freedmen's rights. But if you look at the dates, and I'll come back to the Paxton, you know, that he was actually in office, you know, this was a period of time where lynching was at its highest, you know, in the country. So even as president, right, where he was doing what he could, I think, behind the scenes, right, to help Black families, he could not pass, you know, or nor was he advocating for the kind of legislation, right, that would stop the terrorism that Black folks were leaving the South for in the first place, right? So again, you know, kind of going back to this, you know, crusading knight motif, and asking myself, you know, who exactly, you know, was Benjamin Harrison, you know, crusading for, right? Because his constituency, you know, and just in terms of like racial constituency, like not political constituency, you know, they were crusading for a very particular demographic of white folks. You know what I mean? So you I'm making those connections. And then, I come to the Paxton. What was interesting about this is that this is not necessarily a usual, painting for Paxton, just in terms of size as well as subject matter. And it's called, Glow of Gold, Gleam of Pearl, again, very ethereal, white female nude. And it's, installed directly across from the Tiffany window. And coming back, to this history of lynching, and, thinking to myself, well, this is fascinating that we're talking about crusading knights. What was the fictive reasoning, right, for lynching in the first place? The so-called protection, right, of this very ethereal and oppressive, I may add, to a lot of white women, sort of mythology of white femininity, right? So we know, obviously Black men were not just raping white women, unbridledly in the South during the Gilded Age, which in Black studies we actually call the nadir. But we do know that white men were absolutely raping Black women unbridledly across the South, during this time, particularly at this time. We talk a lot about lynching, but we don't often talk about rape, as a lynching tactic. And so that was happening, to Black women, how Black women didn't have access, right, to this kind of femininity, right? Matter of fact, we were deemed, mythologized, pathologized, right, as the quintessential opposite of this femininity, So again, it's like when you start reading into how the work represents, the broader historical context that it grew out of, you don't necessarily have to, well, I should say it like this, like, typically when we're reinterpreting, right, historical work, I think the burden is, unfairly and kind of unnecessarily put on Black contemporary artists or Black contemporary art, right, to fill those spaces. And if you actually, remove the work from the mythology, of American history and American art history and place it squarely back, right, in the history from which it grew out of, the narrative is there. You don't really have to do a whole lot of research, to find this. This was not deep archival research. You know what I'm saying? This was basically, again, just kind of recontextualizing the work, in a greater historical narrative. The other thing, talking about space, was the painting, the Paxton is glazed. So it has like a sheet of glass over it, to protect it. And so when you stand, right, in particular places in the gallery, the Tiffany window is reflected, in a very prominent way, right, on top of Paxton's nude figure. Particularly like, Michael's presence, as this knight. And again, I was like, it really doesn't get any better than that, and sort of making, this kind of triangular, connection between, again, like how the works actually tout, this Gilded Age narrative, and this, I think, more negative, right, narrative about that time period that is very present in the work, right, that isn't necessarily in the interpretation, that I wanted to pull out. So from that, I came to like this kind of light bulb moment where I was like, yeah, like my curatorial practice, I'm pretty much approaching American art and its maintenance, right, within museum collections as more problematic, right, more insidious, than instructive. Right. So it's more of a mythology, than it is, I think, an actual history. Like there's so much that's erased. There's so much that's left out, including, ways in which these white artists, are grappling with a lot of this stuff, in their personal lives, in the work itself, where it's just kind of written, out of the history. And with that, it was like, okay, this is not so much news, knows. You know, it's not that museum professionals don't know this. It's not that American art historians or European art historians aren't aware of this stuff. You know what I'm saying? So it's a very purposeful, it's very deliberate, right? And so for me, it was like, instead of kind of taking on that responsibility as the Black curator, right? Let me actually put the burden back on white people, you know, back on white art administrators, white curators, white institutions. And another serendipitous, you know, kind of moment with this was there was the collector who owned this work was downsizing, you know, moving to a smaller home, you know, was losing kind of like wall space, reached out to the institution, said, you know, I want to lend, you know, would you be interested? And I said, oh, absolutely, I would be totally interested. Because again, a painting like this, you know, particularly Robert Colescott, and just his grapplings and like the way that he really worked through miscegenation, you know, and again, in his personal life and his family history, as well as in, you know, American history. And, you know, the title says it all, right? Knowledge of the past is key to the future. And if you look at the figure, you know, I mean, he's playing on, you know, the iconography of Saint Sebastian and his martyrdom, but also kind of the crucifixion of Christ, right? So just the religious aspect, you know, plays back to the Tiffany window. But the figure is, you know, half Black male, half white woman, right? And these nooses, you know, that connect, right, the white male and the Black female, you know, to the body. And he's saying, you know, visually that, like, if we do not start conversing about the realities, you know, of racial mixing, and particularly sexual violence and racial violence, right, around race in this country, it's a crucifix. It's a unwillingness, right, to deal with the realities of it, you know, will result in a type of crucifixion for all Americans, right? So you have this stack of skulls over here on the side, right? And you have the heels where they look almost like on fire with like this really quick, you know, brushstroke, right? In these really, really bright colors. And, you know, to a certain degree, you can kind of read this as like the river Styx almost. You know, he's saying, you know, because to a certain degree, Colescott himself, you know, when you look into his family history, right, and the whole idea or the realities of racial mixing, you know, and miscegenation, and, you know, who's not Black enough, you know, or not white enough, you know, and how that affected him both as a person, as an artist, affected his relationship with his family members, the whole nine. When you look at that, right, it's like, at some point, you know, we really do have to start telling the truth about this stuff. And to a large degree, museums are, you know, like prime culprits, you know, because they really instruct and socialize both, I think, subconsciously and unconsciously, people how to see, you know, what is actually seeable, right? Who is actually seeable, you know, whose narratives matter, you know, when it comes to, you know, to this particular history, and whose don't. You know, who's actually seen as human, right? And who's not, you know, who's citizen and who's not, you know. And again, you know, those things are very real, you know, in museum culture, you know. And again, like Colescott is saying here, if we don't get really real about this shit, you know, excuse my French, you know, we're gonna, and what's the year on this? 1996, you know what I'm saying? So here we are in 2020, having the exact same conversation, you know, that Black revolutionaries were having in the 70s, that Black civil rights workers, Black and white, I should say, civil rights workers were having in the 50s, that the NAACP was having in the 20s, you know, that Black abolitionists were having in the 1850s, right? And I can go all the way back, you know, to the revolution. The demands, the challenges, the asks, the issues are exactly the same, you know. And so at some point, somebody, you know, really has to tell the truth, you know, about, again, you know, not so much the presence or the want for equity, right, but the reasons why the inequity is there. So I kind of borrowed, or not kind of, I borrowed the title from the Whitney's 2015 inaugural exhibition, America is Hard to See, because as they really started to, grapple with some of this stuff in their permanent collection when they moved into the new building. And this was another kind of like, subversive choice of mine, right? To use this title, again, as a way to put the burden, back on to, I would say, me using it at IMA, and then again, the Whitney, institutions who have been central who have been central in the culture and in the reasoning, right? Perpetuating the reasons why the inequity exists in the first place, and so it's not so much a window, right? Or I'm, was hoping, right, it would act less as a window and more of a mirror, to make, the institution kind of look at itself, right? And even larger than that, which is why I actually chose the Whitney's title for this, was to make the field look at itself. You know what I mean? And I think that worked in some cases, didn't work in every case. I think this piece, did go over really well. I love how, particularly the docents, the docent corps took it up, and really toured it and engaged it, and were really happy about it. It was actually something that I had, as I was working through it, that I worked through with, my docents and one of my other curatorial colleagues too. So it's something that I'm really, kind of proud of, but it was also, again, going back to the institutional temperature taking, it was like the institution kind of missed the point, right? In terms of like not being able to be self-reflective. The work following, right, that grew out of this project, I kind of sat back and watched, the institution kind of make fumble after fumble after fumble, and so as I was working into, the project that was actually slated for me to do last year or next year, I knew, at a very early point in time, I was like, there's no way, because the institution just isn't ready, because I've kind of set up, and I think even some of my colleagues as well, right? It's like we kind of set up what I would call the oops, right? The alley oops, like to use a basketball analogy, and the institution missed the dunk every single time, and I mean, and there were some things that happened that were, that actually did, kind of go positively, but in terms of genuine equity, right? Genuine inclusivity, I don't know if it's necessarily unwillingness, right? Or just like not knowing how, to look at oneself. Once that became super clear, to me, I knew, that there was an adjustment that I had to make, because when you do equity work, right, when you're doing this work, particularly when you're working with individuals, organizations, or institutions that I sometimes say are starting from like -0, the very first step, in this work after the temperature taking, is disruption, right? That's all you can really do, is create the disruption, right? And then you have to kind of step back and watch what the institution or what the individual does with the disruption, right? Does it try to mend itself to go back to stat quo? Or does the enlightenment, or realization happen to say, okay, yeah, there's a problem? In regards to new fields, it was definitely, in my opinion, everybody may not agree with me, but in my opinion, institutionally, it was we are going to try to stop the bleeding, right? We're going to pack it, with everything that we can, right, to stop the hemorrhaging. The enlightenment, I think, happened on several levels in terms of individuals and, staff, docents, volunteers, that kind of thing. But these were already people who were committed to doing the work in the first place, right? Who wanted to do the work, who were excited, about my hiring, because it was like, okay, here's somebody that can actually like get us down in the trenches of it. And the institution was like, yeah, no, I don't think so. And the reason why I'm speaking about it so publicly like this, is because I've watched institutions, I've worked and consulted with institutions that have either done the same thing, or who have chosen to do the work, you know. And I think when you get that, right, like when you kind of know what you're dealing with, this is something else I'll say about, you know, equity or anti-racism work, you know, the resignation is almost required, because you can't make people do shit that they don't want to do. You know, an analogy that I use is like, you know, sitting in somebody else's house saying, you should really paint your living room fuchsia. Ain't nothing in the house fuchsia, right? Couch ain't pink, right? Person don't even like pink. And you're like, I think you should really, you know, paint your living room fuchsia. And they're like, well, I don't really want to paint my living room fuchsia. And you're like, you should paint your living room fuchsia because it's the right thing to do. You know, you can't be in somebody else's house telling them what to do in their own house. You see what I'm saying? And as, right, an anti-racism activist, you know, as a social justice, you know, scholar, activist, curator, whatever, you know, I think the other thing that you have to know how to do, you know, it's like you have to know when to stop. You have to know when you're not talking, right, to the right people. You have to know that when the people you are talking to are no longer listening to you, you know, which is something else, right, that happened to me in New Fields. You know, I can pinpoint the moment when the institution stopped listening. You know what I'm saying? And so when that happens, you have to move on to the next thing, you know, and I will do it again, you know, and I will disrupt the next, you know, the next place. But again, these are the I think realities, you know, of equity work, that I just wanted to, you know, touch on, you know, in this forum. And I thank you, you know, for being here and listening.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Kelly, can you hear me?
Yep, I hear you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kelli Morgan. That was, wow, transformational, introspective, uncomfortable in all the ways that I think we needed it to be to have this kind of honest conversation. So I really appreciate everything that you shared, the vulnerability that you gave us, the transparency that you gave us. I truly, truly appreciate that. We do have some questions from the chat, so I'm just kind of gonna dive right in, if that's okay with you. So the first question was, you gave lots of examples of how this is a broken system. And so the first question that came through that I think is good to list, because there's a lot happening right now that's showcasing, I won't say good examples, but ways to start to steer the conversation in a different way. And so it says, are there any examples you can cite of museums or cultural institutions that are addressing these issues of equity well, or at least progressing the efforts?
Oh God, yeah. You know, one institution that is like near and dear to me in that regard, and thanks, Kim, you know, for that question. Thanks for coming today too. I miss you a lot. Is the Clay Studio, you know, in Philadelphia. You know, so this is a smaller institution, you know, but was also kind of predominantly white, where a rupture happened at some point, and not necessarily institutional, what do you call it? Like where, you know, the kind of damning, right, you know, really racist thing happened. But it was a conversation, you know, between the director, between the board members that were like, okay, you know, we really need to change this, you know, and we need to do it in a very responsible way. And so from that point, right, the senior leaders and the board did the work, you know, brought in to literally change the framework of pretty much the whole institution. The other thing, and maybe, yeah, I guess I can say this, but like actually what the rupture was that they had to move. That's what it was. You know, they had to move from where they were, you know, very white, affluent space in Center City, Philly, to Northeast Philly, you know, which is pretty much Latinx, you know, working class, poor, that they did not have a full presence, right? And when that became like the realities, right, of what that meant for them, as an institution, because it's not like these communities are already doing their own thing, right? Like I can say that, like, it's not like the people in Northeast Philly was really checking for the clay studio, right? Right. Even Black communities in Indy, like, it's not like, people, we find our, we create our own frameworks, we create our own value systems, we create our own access, right? Black folks in Indiana ain't necessarily checking for new fields either. But the typical approach, right, is that, we're the great, major institution. Let us bestow all of our greatness upon you. And Clay Studio took a very different approach, where it was like, we're new to this space, we actually want to, we're coming into your neighborhood, so we want to come in, as a partner, not as a like interloper. And they worked, for 5-6 years, on building those relationships, right, with the people who were there, building those communities and those spaces into the framework of the institution. And so it's been a beautiful project to kind of watch. They're just kind of breaking ground right now, on building the new building, but the programming and, again, just everything about it, centers the people who were already there. It doesn't center the Clay Studio as an institution. And that's a project, that I've been involved with in some kind of way, more officially now recently, than, from its very beginning, right? And so that was why I was like, I can say these things, because I've watched institutions do it. I've watched institutions get it right, and I've watched several institutions, really get it wrong. But I think the Clay Studio model is a really good model.
Thank you. So the next question, you and I talk about this often, this idea of representation. A question came through that says, it's hard to work at cultural institutions and see displays of white purity, but rarely see representation of Black and brown people. So I kind of want to take that a step further. We talked about diversity, we talked about equity, we talked about inclusion, but something you and I talk about a lot is liberation.
Yes.
And so I'm curious if you would share your perspective on the ideas of liberation theory for, I don't even want to say people of color, but people who matter. Like, people who matter.
Yes.
And not generalizing us in this, absurd category, but people who matter in these spaces that do come with this white spatial imaginary.
I'm like, you're not gonna like my answer. I am very much so of the opinion now that traditional institutions are beyond reformation. We are never going to be able to do that work in these institutions. We're just not. We have to either go right to our current institutions that already exist, or we are going to have to build new ones. And we're going to have to build new ones that are specifically couched in our own value systems. So the point is, which I think is happening, like on a national level, we have to value ourselves and our value systems more than we value theirs, right? And more than we value their spaces, right? Or validation and recognition and representation from them, of them. That was something else that really came to me in doing this work, Denicia, because that is the crux. I would say myself and my colleague, Latanya Autry, you know what I'm saying? Our curatorial practice is based in Black liberation, right? It is couched, firmly, in anti-white supremacy, right? Anti-racism. That is how we do this work. And let me say, all Black curators ain't doing this work from that space. And with that, if you are committed to that, it's like the Audre Lorde quote, right? Like, you can never dismantle, the master's house with the master's tools. So if complete liberation is the goal, we're not going to get it, in these institutions, which is the thing that led me to say all Black curators ain't doing this work. Black liberation ain't the goal. For all of us, who are in these positions. And I'll say it even my own naivete, right? Particularly when you talk about white liberals, right? Where it was like believing that it was possible, believing that this was something that these institutions wanted to do, and then that literal moment where it was like, oh no, I'm the diversity hire. Like, I'm the token Black person. I'm the box check. So it was like using my position to kind of undermine that, and to kind of challenge that, because where I would really, particularly with, I think, the IMA, administration, was running up against this friction, right? Or this really these fraud exchanges, was because my work came specifically out of a Black framework, and it wasn't something that they could understand because nobody had ever taken the time to even acknowledge the fact that there are other frameworks outside, of like the white middle class, American value system, right? In their mind, it was like, oh, she's an Americanist, and she does this really cool critical race stuff, and I mean, I'm like simplifying it, right? Tremendously. But nobody really knew what that meant. You know what I'm saying? And so for those of us as artists, as activists, as curators who work from those frameworks, we'll never be able to do them in these institutions, because the institutions aren't, they just aren't designed, for that kind of work. So we really have to create our own spaces. We super do. Now, having this happen to me 3 times, I'm just like, yeah, and then subsequently watching the field respond, to my resignation. I think people will be super surprised to like know how many people have my ear, right? To know how many people, directors included, across the field, that called me, to say some very specific things, right? About, kind of behind the scenes or like under the radar, to affirm, everything that I was saying, everything that I'm saying even now. So it's the thing that everybody knows, right? But nobody likes to admit. And I think even sometimes as Black folk, because it's like, as my mom would say, we have these moments where we feel like we have arrived, because we're in these institutions. But even for myself, it was like, you can't create this kind of change, Kelli, unless you are a museum director. Curators don't have enough power. You know what I'm saying? Even watching my white colleagues, curators, and, and other staff around the institution, when they saw that it was like, okay, the administration's not listening to Kelli anymore. Not only is administration not listening to Kelli anymore, administration has totally deemed Kelli unprofessional now. So now we have to say something. And they took it up, and took it up collectively. And then they began to get attacked and retaliated against and ignored. You know what I'm saying? And so so that is another, to kind of get, but be more specific to your question, like talking about liberation, coming from a space now, where I was working, across the board with white folks, in the institution, Black folks around the city, for this type of liberation. And, and I hate to say it like this, but, we moved the needle a millimeter, and so it's like, I think, again, it goes back to truth, being able to be not only truthful with the people that you're advocating to, or challenging, but also being able to be truthful to yourself.
I love that. I say often that this unlearning process that a lot of these spaces are going through has to stop coming at our expenses. Mm-hmm. It just lands on our back every single time. And so for you saying that, we can't wait on them. We have to start building our own spaces, acknowledging our own spaces. Not even a shameless plug. I'm sitting in the Black Cultural Center right now. Mm-hmm. One of the legendary spaces in Indiana, across the country. So I appreciate you saying that. Another question that we had come through, it says, can you talk a bit about how your work, and I know you touched on this, but how your work addresses not only the inequities within our institutions, but also the systemic oppressions that present themselves within the symbiotic relationship between the institution and the community?
I try to like illuminate that, right? So that was why, I started out talking about this gate, you know, geographical, this physical, I keep saying it wrong, it's physical representation of geographical racism. And the fact, which I can say now because I don't work here, is that Newfields is absolutely a microcosm, of the city itself. I think I was in Indy maybe like the 6-month, 8-month mark. People would say, well, how do you feel? How do you feel about the city? What do you think? And in the first 6 months, I was very nice and very polite, but by that 8th month, when it really started wearing on me, when it dawned on me where I lived and what I was actually dealing with, I started telling people, flat out, Indy is I wouldn't say the only place, right? But it is a place where white supremacy is normalized across the board. Black folks, white folks, poor folks, rich folks, don't matter. Now, not that there aren't people working against that, right? Because there are plenty of people, doing really great work, to change that. But overall, Indianapolis as a city, it is codified white supremacy unlike anywhere I have ever seen it. It's one thing to study it, right? It's another thing to see it like kind of live and direct. So give in the institution, the same thing is present, right? It's the same reality. You could count, the PLC, museum professionals at Newfields, on 2 hands. And recently, the institution just lost 3 pretty prominent, staff of color. That was something that didn't necessarily make the news, around my resignation. I was resignation number 7. You know what I'm saying? And not everybody, resigned because of racial issues. Certain people did, but it is a greater, culture of a greater toxic culture, along various lines, that influence other resignations. But I think, America is hard to see, it's definitely one of those works, that was exactly what I was trying to do. It was like getting the institution to see, that there's a very obvious, narrative that's left out of the interpretation of this work. When myself and Brent Jackson and, Samuel Levi Jones, curated Sam's show, that work was all about this stuff, systemic oppression. Even the work that Sam created for the show, out of IMA materials, was all about, the symbiotic relationship, how the institutions, deliberately erase. And again, I think that was something else that the institution just missed, or like missed the real point of it. It was like here's this really cool thing, right, that we did, with no real roots, to why, Sam even said yes. You know what I'm saying? Why Brent and I even worked with Sam to interpret that show and that work in that way, right? It was completely like divorce, from all of the toxic ways, that white supremacy is afoot, within that institution. And again, that's just one, program, exhibition, institution. Program, exhibition, activity, put on by the institution that the institution like totally misses the point, that the curator, the artist, right, are actually trying to make, in this regards. And I think until, that was another thing that really fueled my resignation. It was like the inability, for the administration to really see that. So then I had to actually say to myself, yeah, there's an unwillingness, because it's not like myself and several of my other curators, or, other curators, other colleagues around the institutions, have been doing work, right, to flush that out. Right, to flush out that, how that operates, that symbiosis operates. And the institution's like, we hang at Christmas lights. We just brought in 1 million people, because we got this really cool Christmas festival. And not that that's a bad thing, you got to keep the lights on, you got to pay the bills, but it was just like, okay, so, but we just not gonna talk about none of this other shit, that's happening over here. And it was really frustrating, not just for me, but I think a lot of us, who have really been pushing, to get the institution to at least acknowledge it fully. Like I think there are some symbolic acknowledgments, right, that have happened, or there's been a lot of lip service, but there hasn't been, again, like that concrete, rubber to the road, real responsibility. And I'll just flat out say it, because they don't actually want to do it. They really don't. And that ain't, again, that's not unique to Newfield. We're kind of watching that happen, just across the country right now. And so, coming back again to the question of like, you can do the work, right? But if the institution won't do the work, it doesn't, I wouldn't necessarily say it doesn't work, right? Because you can't put public pressure. But it's not something that you can sustain, in being a practitioner of the work.
I think that's very accurate, so Newfields is what, 100 some odd years old right now.
Yeah.
As you're talking about investing in your own spaces, creating your own spaces, I think this next question is very appropriate for that, but I also kind of want to pin the importance of understanding that spaces we begin to create will look vastly different than the spaces we're used to.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. In so many ways. I'm sitting in the Black Cultural Center. We just turned 50 years old. We've got a stellar reputation behind us, but we're nowhere near as big as some of these other spaces across the world that they find as trusted members of their community, So like, as we're investing in generating new spaces, giving ourselves leniency to understand that those spaces are going to look different, but that doesn't mean that they are less worthy or less valuable.
Exactly.
So this question kind of feeds into that. As can you speak to the significance of studying from an interdisciplinary perspective through Afro-American studies for your practice as a curator?
Oh, absolutely. That's a really great question, because that is like central. That is one of the reasons why I do the work like I do. Because I always say, in just kind of a facetious way, right? Like I came to art history through the back door when nobody was looking. So I learned American art history from a Black framework, because as much as art history is really lacking, right, and its curriculum, around African American art, Black studies, kind of lacks a similar framework, right? You can really access it through like visual cultural studies, right? But it was all self-study for me, so it was literally, because this is 2010, 2011, so to study art history, I was literally calling people, because the classes just didn't exist, and it was minding the footnotes, buying the books, reading them myself, reaching out to the authors. Some people called me back, some people didn't, and so much of it was like my own piecing together. A second thing, about interdisciplinary study was that the people who did respond, both Black art historians and white art historians, was like, okay, this is what you want to do. I'm going to give you this crash course to get you right. So it was like studying with people extensively, to kind of get as much of it, as I could. Coming from Afro-Am, though, I think what a lot of people take for granted, because a lot of people don't even know what we do, in African American studies. But I came from both an institution and a department that is rooted in grassroots activism. UMass is like academic activism ground zero, right? Right. So there's that. And then again, the discipline in and of itself is interdisciplinary, right? So for me, going to UMass, our study, of quote unquote, as people would say, like Black history, right? It's really world history. So we started in like 13th century Europe, with what was happening in Europe that prompted colonization, right? That prompted, world conquest. What was the rest of the world doing and had been doing, right? So we learned about ancient African nations, the ancient indigenous nations, as well as ancient Asian nations, right? And you get all of that history, right? I always say, the Europeans were super late to the game, right? So in learning all of that, that's economic history, that's political history, that's philosophy, that's sociology, right? That's science, in a lot of ways, because you have to grapple with the whole genetic stuff, and how, Europeans really shaped, the science of genetics, right? To in this racist way. That's anthropology, that's archaeology, that's geology. And honestly, our first, year of coursework is called major works. We read like 75 books, now you can't read all of them cover to cover, but we get a full sweep, of again, like what the world looked like, and then we work from European colonization, pretty much up to the present, right? So we get this crash course in like all of the disciplines. So in doing that, I'm also learned those academic frameworks, so I know how to apply, right, a social work framework. I know how to apply a sociological framework. I know how to utilize an art historical framework. I know how to utilize an economics, analytical framework. So I bring all of that, to the space, to the object, to the space, whatever. Most art historians are not trained in that way at all. You know what I'm saying? So when you say, I've just kind of titled it, right? Like this, critical race cultural history, but it's so much more than that. And so again, when you're trained in that way, you can see it larger, you really kind of like from a bird's eye view. And I think that, scares people, just being real, about my experiences, so many experiences of my other colleagues who do this work, it frightens people, it triggers insecurities, like you not believe, because a lot of times we're coming in, whether it's fellows or curatorial assistants or assistant curator or associate curator, whatever title, you're given, the thought, the institution assumes, because you're this little Black kid coming from this public institution, you don't know shit. So despite the fact that you've been in school for the last 7 years, getting a graduate degree, but it's like, we're going to bestow all of our knowledge, upon you. We're going to teach you so much. And then they find out that not only do you know a lot just on your own about this kind of work and these types of frameworks, but that you actually know a whole lot more than they do. So we're being supervised by people who are not as well trained as we are. You know what I'm saying? So then they don't really know, right, what to do with you. And so you just, well, I think some of us, really struggle. Some of us, I think it's a struggle across the board, right? And then you had the classism in the field among Black curators themselves, right? And the reason why I'm bringing this up to answer this question is because of the sheer number of Black and brown young women, Black and Latinx and Native young women, and Asian too, that I mentor around the country, who call me, who know that I'm accessible, who email me and say, Kelli, you were the only person that responded. You were the only person that called me back, right? And then I say, well, who did you reach out to? And it's the litany list of all of the Black curators that we know and love. Right? And not to say, mentorship ain't everybody's bag. I get that, right? But it's like, there isn't a tradition, of that, right? And so you have all of these things, that are kind of working simultaneously, and being an interdisciplinarian. I always say I'm a true interdisciplinarian. And as my colleague, Michelle Hayes, says so eloquently, I don't have the luxury to just do one thing, because I'm about liberation and I'm about helping these kids. I'm about creating, spaces as an interdisciplinarian that my students and their students, won't have to deal with this shit, when they get into the work field as artists, as curators, as whatever, so I teach, I mentor, I consult, I write, I lecture, you know what I'm saying? I do as much as I can. I put myself in front of and as accessible to as many people as I can be, because there is that kind of wall up and this mystery behind, curators and what curation does and like this elitism. And so it's like trying to break, just really trying to break that down. And if I had not been trained, in that way, maybe that wouldn't, necessarily be, central. I think the other thing, when you talk about interdisciplinarity, is also like how I've been talking about frameworks and value systems, it's how you were raised, too. I was raised in a space, that didn't necessarily value, whiteness and white people, or in white spaces, more, right, than Black spaces and Black people. I'm a Detroiter, and I'm a tried and true Detroiter. I ain't one of these new Detroit people. So coming out of a union framework, right, in an organization along that lines, there's a lot of conversation about, police brutality and these police killings and, in the history of that, right, the 20th century history of that particularly, or 21st century. But one of the only cases, of that kind of violence, right, and that kind of murder, where the police officers were not just charged, but were convicted and put under the jail, you know what I'm saying, happened in Detroit, in 1992. So just as a Black woman from Detroit, I'm just a different kind of motherfucker just in general, and that really informs, how I go about this work. Like if anything else, you do the work, you get the degrees, blah, 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 but at the end of the day, I'm a fighter. I ain't scared of no fight. Like right now, I needed to take a break because I'm just tired of fighting. I've gotten tired of it. But yeah, I ain't never running, from a fight, and particularly not a fight that's going to benefit, the people that I love in the spaces, that I care about. You know what I'm saying? And so I think all of those things, really inform, the interdisciplinary ways that I come at the work.
Thank you so much, Kelli. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. This was good.
This was great. Yes, thank you. And I hope that, you are finding that rejuvenation and peace that you need right now, because knowing what you went through here in Indy, all my heart goes out to you, and I just want you to rest. Get your skin back thick, soft, supple, like be who you need to be. And I really hope that where you are now is giving you that joy.
It is. And I, to end there, Denise, I think it's so important. Like self-care is y'all, like if y'all didn't know 5 years ago, or a year ago, let me tell you, because people ask me a lot, in the last, what has it been, like 6 weeks now, where people are like, well, what changed? And the thing that changed, is it became less, about my career, per se, and more about myself, and it was like, and not in a selfish way, but it was like, yo, there has to be more to my life than fighting white supremacy. I actually started to put up a post. I was telling Denise at the beginning of this, where I was at my nephew's football game, on Saturday. And it's like, 13-year-olds, running around playing football in like all the worst ways. But I wanted to post, on Instagram, or Facebook and say, what's better, than kind of fighting white people in art institutions? Watching my nephew play football. It's like those things are super important. So, to just, if I leave on, a positive note, it's like, take care of yourselves. My profile picture, on Facebook says this now. It's like saying no may piss them off, but it will make you free. And this was me publicly, not just telling Newfields no, right? But telling the field no. And what happens when we collectively just start telling these people no? I think white people really don't understand how exhausting, right, they are, to us in these spaces. And I think as my grandmother would say, nobody's gonna take care of you like you. You know what I'm saying? Ain't nobody gonna love you like you. Ain't nobody gonna fight for you like you. You know, so love yourselves, you know, hard, and fight for yourselves for your own, you know, peace of mind.
Wow, round of applause, right? Like, thank you so much, Kelli.
Thank you.
This was
Hope
great.
everybody has a good day and a good weekend.
Yes, yes. So there's a survey in the chats. If you all would take a moment to fill that out at some point throughout this week. That helps us build spectacular programming like what we had today. We really want to know what you need from us. As we're in this virtual space, we're trying to be great stewards of our space as best we can, and go through this learning curve together. So I appreciate your feedback. Up next, we do have a couple of events next week that I think are going to be just as phenomenal. An artist talk. We have a great exhibition in our gallery right now by Jason Daffrey Thompson out of Kentucky. Beautiful work, and he'll be doing an artist talk. And a series that kicks off next week about disparities in healthcare for the Black community. So I think both of those would be phenomenal for our guests to participate in. And we'll let people kind of log off at their will, and I'll keep the space open if anyone has further questions that they want to put into the chat. Thank you, Kelli.
Thanks, Anisha. Thanks, everybody.